Good afternoon, everybody. I am Colaianni. I am the founder and chair of WiHTL, Women in Hospitality, Travel and Leisure, an organization devoted to increase leadership at senior level, increasing the number of women and the people of color at senior level across hospitality, travel and leisure. We have a very ambitious mission. We aim to make a positive difference to 5 million women and people from ethnic minorities across hospitality, travel and leisure globally by 2025. We are at 2 million people now, so we've got a way to go. In addition to myself, you can see on the screen, I'm here with Elliott Goldstein, the managing partner at the MBS Group. Katy Bennett, the Director of People and Organization at PwC, and then Gina Bari and Joannan from the WiHTL team joining me as well. First of all, just a few thoughts. You know, it is a National Inclusion Week this week, and so we thought it was really appropriate to launch this piece of research this week. And a few thoughts around the reason for doing this piece of research. Like many people, I have grown increasingly concerned about the impact of the pandemic on women and people from ethnic minorities in particular, which is the core of what we do at WiHTL. And I was going to use the word persuaded. It was easily done to persuade Elliott and Katy to help us conduct this research. Both Elliott and Katy have been long-term supporters of WiHTL and have been involved in a lot of the research and the report that we have done over the last few years. So today we will be focusing on the gender piece, and on the 8th of October, as you know, October is a Black History Month. We will be focusing on the race and ethnicity piece. I can see that some of you have discovered the chat function. I encourage you to use that to share your comments, reflections, and your questions for our speakers today. What we will do, we'll have Elliott and Katy present the findings from their interviews and survey. And then we'll open up to questions from the audience, comments, and your thoughts. The session is being recorded, and we look forward to a very engaging session with all of you. Elliott, we'll start with you, sharing your presentation first, and then we'll move on to Katy.
Okay, is that working?
Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. A real pleasure to be here, and Taya, as always, thank you for inviting us to partner with you on this piece of work. And yeah, it's a real pleasure and honour to talk you through this on behalf of the team at the MBS Group. For those of you that don't know us, we're an executive search firm that specialises in all consumer-facing industries, but especially the travel, leisure, and hospitality space. And just before I move into the substance of the presentation, I wanted to thank everyone on this call, so just looking at the participant list, who made the time to contribute to this piece of research. I know that many of you had urgent conflicting priorities to attend to over the summer. So really delighted that you were able to find the time for to contribute to this. I think it shows just how high it sits on your personal agenda and that of your companies. So I think just to start by saying that a number of us have been around this table with the WiHTL community for a number of years now. And those that you were at the launch of our annual report in February, which really does feel like like a different lifetime ago. I think it finally felt as if we were able to report across momentum in achieving more diverse leadership teams at every level of leadership in hospital travel and leisure. However, as you are of course all painfully aware, our sectors have been disproportionately affected by the devastating fallout from COVID-19. And collectively our industry has been more turbulent and more challenged than we could ever have imagined. And I think we're all trying to adapt our businesses while the sand constantly shifts beneath us. And in many cases, I think our number one priority has been survival. So we thought it was particularly important amidst these very pressing and very urgent matters of survival to actually look under the bonnet to see what is happening to D&I over the period. And to find this out, we turned once again to the chairs, CEOs and group HR directors of the largest businesses within our sectors. And hopefully, as we were about to sort of convey to you, we were able to take the pulse of the leaders in those sectors and also to dig into some specific actions they've taken across a range of critical issues during the outbreak. So I guess let's start with some of the key themes. I think firstly, and this is a consistent theme throughout all of our research, and something that PwC and MBS have been saying for a long time. We found that just 15% of companies within our sector had measured the impact of key temporary people issues taken during the crisis on female, minority, ethnic colleagues. And that figure is even lower when we turn to companies that have made redundancies or have entered into consultation. Here, just 6% of companies have specifically measured the impact on women and employees from ethnic minorities. And I think this really does give us a black hole of information, which is all the more critical when we consider that 89% of companies we spoke to told us that they have already reduced their workforce or anticipate doing so in the near future. So there is, to start by saying, a lack of good data on the actions we've taken on diversity. Secondly, I should say that our research also identified a gap between intent and action. 77% of leaders we spoke to reported that D&I remained either as much of a priority during COVID-19 or had actually become a higher priority, which is really wonderful to hear from the leaders of our businesses. And I think there are probably five reasons driving that. I think firstly and very practically, COVID-19 is first and foremost a people crisis within our sectors. It's an acute risk to health, has forced leaders to think much more empathetically and much more holistically about their workforce. And I think home working has given leaders greater insight into their team's personal lives and the issues that impact their ability to work. Indeed, probably shouldn't say this so publicly, but many of the CEOs I spoke to as part of this research commented how this window into colleagues' life was really the first time they had actually understood the practical challenges of raising a family whilst at the same time juggling a career. In addition, I think that coronavirus has seen greater pressure from consumers to do the right thing. Whilst some boards continue to ask difficult questions about D&I alongside the core questions of survival. I think thirdly, for obvious reasons, the role of the chief HR officer has been elevated over the last few months, and this has increased the overall prominence of people-related issues around the board table. And lastly, by no means least, and we'll discuss this slightly more in the gender webinar scheduled for next week, the BLM movement has taken hold over the course of the pandemic, ensuring that issues of race and ethnicity have been high on many corporate agendas. That being said, despite this heightened awareness of people-related issues, it hasn't necessarily translated into tangible short-term actions. And our findings suggest that, number one, companies haven't measured the impact of furlough or redundancies on female ethnic minority employees. Number two, D&I hasn't been regularly discussed at board or even raised at board meetings at all. And number three, most companies have not evolved their D&I strategy or implemented new interventions in response to the crisis. And I think this disconnect between what in the one hand is amazing intent around D&I and actually not necessarily the right amount of action, it does definitely run the risk of leading to unintended consequences. In the current crisis, a lack of data at a time when we're all making far-reaching decisions at pace makes it virtually impossible to know if harm is being done to the D&I agenda. And even though companies don't necessarily have the data, our research suggests that companies' response to COVID may well be having a disproportionate effect on women and ethnic minorities. And indeed, Katy, PwC will pick that up later on in this session with their survey of 15,000 employees from the sector. And of course, I should say that the industry's first priority here obviously must be survival. I don't think a single leader we spoke to as part of our research is deliberately making decisions that negatively impact on female and minority ethnic employees. That being said, there is certainly a disproportionate impact being felt. And I think that there are, again, 4 reasons behind that. Firstly, large-scale people decisions such as furlough or redundancies are definitely acting to exaggerate existing imbalances. Even though significant progress has been made in diversity in recent years, that varies dramatically by function and level of seniority. Wholesale decisions about people in specific functions or therefore at specific levels therefore do possibly disproportionately affect women. With some exceptions, notably in HR, functions that are traditionally dominated by men have been less likely to be furloughed or had redundancies than those dominated by women. For example, finance or IT have been seen as central to survival over the last period and typically comprise more men than women, whilst other functions such as marketing and comms, which are often more diverse from a gender perspective, have been deemed to perhaps be more expendable or less critical during the current crisis. Secondly, the last period has seen some of the previous great progress on D&I being undone. For example, one company we spoke to reported that it had made all its employees who have joined its grad scheme in the last 2 years redundant. And that pool of talent was intentionally diverse given their recent increased focus on D&I. Additionally, most companies, for obvious reasons, are scaling back their grad or entry-level programs. And those programs have been invested in across the sector as an amazing tool to ensure diverse talent is coming in at grassroots level. And indeed, even where the graduate programs are ongoing, given the challenges our sector faces in the future, I think we have a question, and leaders in the sector have a question, is if our sector will continue to be attractive to some of the best diverse talents. Alongside this, D&I budgets have been hit hard by tightening cost pressures. And in many cases, existing D&I initiatives have been cancelled and D&I leaders have been made redundant. Additionally, that all-important pressure from shareholders that we've discussed at previous WiHTL events has all but dissipated in the last 8 months, except in the largest of the listed businesses. And considering the impact of these actions, I think a number of themes emerge. I think, as you'll all be aware from some of the previous research, gender diversity within our sector decreases with seniority. And as companies mounted a very rapid response during the initial phases of the pandemic, I think it was felt that decisions were being made amongst a small, closed group of senior leaders. And almost by definition, a lot of these small groups making decisions were possibly all male and almost without exception, all white. And I think that the coronavirus has brought the issue of caring responsibilities, caring responsibilities into sharp relief. With schools shut and relative shielding, there's definitely been a significant impact on the working day of many of the sector's employees. As we know, caring responsibilities still tend to fall disproportionately to women. And perhaps unsurprisingly, many of the companies we spoke to told us that more women rather than men had opted for voluntary furlough. So for the last 6 months, in many cases, which has been a period of time when leaders have been able to demonstrate their true colours, some excellent female leaders have been on the bench, not able to rise to this challenge along their male colleagues. And we suspect that the impact of this will be felt in the sector for many years to come. The visibility of role models is also critically important to developing more balanced leadership teams in the future. And sadly, in many companies, visible female role models are at risk of redundancies. Some companies we spoke to were acutely aware of this and were doing their very best to eliminate role models from redundancy programs. But that being said, many of the role models, some of whom we've highlighted in previous WiHTL initiatives, such as the Women to Watch Index, have not been so fortunate. And lastly, over the past decade, given the lack of diverse ExCo board-ready leadership within our sector, within HTL, we've systematically hired diverse talent into non-sector specific roles, such as HR, marketing, comms, general counsel, data, and IT. With the HTL sector in turmoil, many leaders have reported that female and diverse candidates in these key but non-sector specific roles may choose to exit the sector in favour of lower risk industries. And if this does happen, given that these female appointees are often the only female or minority ethnic voices around the table, the sector will take a significant step back in diverse representation at least two of the levels of leadership we've been looking at, ExCo and direct reports. And anecdotally, I can say as a headhunter, this is already starting. Over the last few months, definitely some of these key talents have already been in touch to discreetly inquire about opportunities in other, less risky sectors. More positively, there's going to be some positives here. I think one of the benefits of COVID-19 has definitely been the acceleration of flexible working, and the speed of which so many of us have adopted to working from home has demonstrated that flexible working, in every sense of the word, is a truly viable option for our sector. And for many businesses, although interestingly not all businesses we spoke to, flexible working could well become the default rather than the exception in the future. So looking ahead, I think despite the challenging circumstances we do face, there are definitely some opportunities that COVID-19 does present, particularly when we talk about restructuring. To use a term that Taya hates, in the past, we've talked about dead man's shoes, presenting a barrier to excellent female or ethnic minority talent progressing. Well, now may well be an opportunity to promote some of these future leaders. And also, the new ways of working have, at least to some extent, unblocked some of the routes with people with different caring and other responsibilities to progressing. And I think, particularly in operational roles, some of the barriers have definitely come down as a result of home working. Just leaving you with this 6 tangible action points that I think came out from our research and the conversations we had. I think first and foremost, make D&I a priority in your business over the next period. And we as headhunters believe there's a commercial imperative for this. Businesses who do not prioritize D&I will suffer as they're outperformed by businesses whose leadership team better reflects their customer base, and indeed who have earned their social license from customers to operate. Secondly, as we have said before, what gets measured gets done, and measuring the impact of potential actions is particularly important in preventing unintended consequences. I think it's clear from this research that in these early stages of the pandemic, most businesses in our sector did not collect meaningful D&I data to inform decision making. Thirdly, we need to consider the impact of decisions you've already made. For example, has reducing diversity in some of your critical teams already increased the likelihood of groupthink? Fourthly, we need to work to protect role models whose loss will have a disproportionate effect on diversity and inclusion throughout the sector. Fifthly, we really do need to embrace flexible working. I was surprised by the number of CEOs who said they were itching to get back to the before office-based culture at a point in time in the future. And lastly, because every cloud really does need to have a silver lining, I think that some of the restructuring that inevitably will come out of this could well enable future leadership to emerge, as I mentioned earlier. Just end by quoting something that Taya says in her introduction to this report. This is not the time to slow down our individual or collective efforts towards creating more inclusive environments. And I think the WiHTL platform is an amazing place to do that. So thank you all for your interest and engagement in driving this agenda. Taya, Katy, over to you.
And thank you, Elliot. We'll switch to Katy's presentation and review the findings of the survey conducted by PwC. In the meantime, just a reminder to type your comments in the chat function. Anything that what you've heard so far, they must have prompted some thoughts. So please type them as we now hand over to Katy. Oh, Katy, we can't hear you. So can you?
Is that better?
Yes, now we can. Yeah.
Apologies. I think that's got to be like the most standard thing that now happens. I've now provided the mute issue for this presentation. So yeah, thank you, Taya. Thank you, Elliot. I'm certainly, delighted to once again have partnered with WiHTL and MBS to look at some of the specific themes around diversity and inclusion within this sector. And what we've done this time, as in previous times, is tried to kind of look at a slightly different data set from Elliot, but ask some very similar questions. So what we did was we went out to try and hear from some of those people working or who have recently been working in the hospitality, travel and leisure industries. So across August 2020, in partnership with Opinium, we went out and talked to 1,500 workers within these industries, trying to get a really good spread across the UK in different regions, and specifically looking to talk to women and those who are Black, Asian or minority ethnic or BAME, to try and get some specific understanding of how experience might be different for different groups, whether that's gender, ethnicity, or those that are parents and carers. And today we're going to share specifically, as talked about, some of those findings, looking at the difference between the experience of men and women within these industries. And we asked a number of questions, but broadly we're trying to understand 4 key themes. So, has inclusion and diversity been put on the back burner because of COVID-19? Do people feel that that's happened to them? And do the experiences that we see different people kind of reporting during the last few months suggest that that's happening? Can we learn things about what we can do in the future? Are there different things that maybe can be accelerated, or where is action most needed? And also just asking generally about what companies have been doing and perhaps what we can learn from that. So they were the kind of things we're trying to understand. We asked workers a series of questions, and I'm just going to share some of the themes from that, many of which very much align with some of the things that Elliot's talked about, and perhaps bring a little bit of data to kind of show the reality of what can sometimes happen where the data isn't available, where decisions are being made, without consideration of inclusion and diversity. So we asked those in our survey a series of questions about their experience of COVID-19. And specifically, we asked them if they felt supported by their employer during this time, and if they felt safe in working during this time. And I suppose the overall positive story here is that most workers did feel supported by their employer during COVID-19, which, given the massive change generated by this, particularly for this industry, is actually a really positive story about the level of support and engagement that workers have in this sector. However, having said that, we did observe differences between the experience of women and men. So 69% of women felt supported by their employer compared to 73% of men. And that difference was at its most kind of stark when we looked at women working in ancillary roles such as cleaning. And there we saw far more women having negative experiences over this period of time. So 29%, almost 30% of women working in ancillary roles said that they had a negative experience during COVID-19 compared to 15% of men. And we also asked for some general comments, and you'll see some of these below. So a bit of a mixture. So some saying they felt respected, they felt that employers really thought carefully about their needs and that people worked together during such a difficult time. But people also talking about not feeling safe at work, getting abuse from specifically customers, and feeling that nobody asked them how things were going, particularly for those working at home. So maybe they felt a little alone and ignored because they were in their home environment. So a real mix of experiences. We also asked how work itself was changing. We know that this is an industry where many workers were put on furlough, had their hours reduced, or unfortunately were made redundant. And so we specifically wanted to understand how that experience might be different for different groups. And here we did see a very big difference between the experience of women and men. So of those we spoke to, 65% of the women had either been furloughed, had their hours reduced, or were made redundant, compared to 56% of men. So a very noticeable difference in the experience of women and men within the industry. As Elliott talked about earlier, we've got to be careful with this data. It's of course only a sample. And we know that because women and men may be in higher proportions in different jobs within the sector, that might partly be influencing some of this data. But even so, it does suggest quite a different experience for women and men. And we know that broader UK data suggests that is what's happening. Perhaps, a little bit more positively, we did see 64% of women who felt that employers really did take their personal circumstances into account when thinking about home working. But again, that was a big difference in the experience of men. So 64% of women felt their personal circumstances were taken into account, compared to 74% of men. And given that in the UK, we know that in general, where there are caring responsibilities, they will probably primarily be the responsibility of a woman within a relationship or in a single parent family. That is concerning that there's such a big difference. Having said that, when we just spoke to parents and carers, we did see that they did feel supported. So 75% of parents, 86% of those who said they had other caring responsibilities felt that their employers really did take that into account and adjust their policies and practices for personal circumstances. So good to see that adjustment happening. On the kind of the flip side, and this is one that it might depend on the circumstance how you interpret it. When we asked people, do you feel that the reason that you were put on furlough or had your hours reduced or were made redundant was related to your gender or your ethnicity? Most people said no. It's only about 1% of people felt that might be the case. But actually 12% of workers who had children who were parents and 18% of those who were carers said that these responsibilities were a factor in the decision for them to be furloughed or have their hours reduced or to be made redundant. Now, that may in some ways be a positive, an example of, as Elliott talked about, people being allowed to voluntarily go on furlough to reflect their caring responsibility. But of course, Elliott did also highlight the downsides of that and the risks associated with that. So a mixed picture here, and the real question will be what the long-term impact of that would be. And again, some examples of particular stories on the right, many talking about, really good, positive, transparent conversations with their employers, but also we did see a lot of stories, as you can imagine, for this sector about the challenges specifically of being a parent or carer at this time and the financial impact of that, whether that's linked to reduced pay or the inability to return to work because of caring responsibility, particularly while schools were closed and childcare was not available. So maybe some unsurprising themes, but really kind of bringing home some of those general messages that Elliott's talked through. And so what are companies doing? Well, We asked participants if their employers were collecting data around ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation or social mobility, and around 40% said yes. So really kind of hits home that there just isn't the data available in this sector outside of gender. And even when we look at gender data, as Elliott has told us, often that data isn't being used. Now, we're going to talk about our general recommendations in a moment, but I suppose I wanted to pause on the data point because the reason I think we've all spoken about it so much is that data can be incredibly powerful in this space. Now, there are complications with getting data beyond gender, and I suspect we'll talk about that more next week when we launch the findings from the ethnicity aspect of this research. But even where that data is available, which it is for gender, the problem is, and what we may be seeing here is it's often used retroactively. So at the end of the year, perhaps when there's some more time, we may look back and reflect on if decisions may have had a different impact for men compared to women. But of course, at that point, often it is too late. Where data can really be powerful is where it is a tool in decision making. And it is a great way to reflect back to leaders as they're making decisions. Are they fair? Do they disproportionately impact different groups of people? And sometimes that will be the reality because of where people happen to have different roles, different responsibilities, and different skills. But often just taking a moment to slow down, to look at data, to test the impact of decisions, and to track how that might impact the overall organization can really help, whether that's about a certain decision in a moment in time or your overall kind of plan and strategy around improving inclusion and diversity in the future. So I think really collecting that data and then using it to drive decisions rather than to measure the impact of decisions is really important. And that's why when we say, well, okay, we've got this data, we've got this information, what next? A big part of that is around basing decisions on clear data. More generally, it's about harnessing the positive of inclusion and diversity. Of course, this is an incredibly difficult time for the sector, a difficult time for all of us as individuals. But inclusion and diversity can still help to drive business results, specifically to help us reach new customers to understand them better. But talking openly about this topic is really important. In a period of time where there are going to be restructuring, where there will be conversations about people's futures and their roles, it can prevent employees from being honest and open. So having those conversations about the experience of being a parent, of being a carer, of what Black Lives Matter might mean to different people is really important, because at this time it might be that those conversations otherwise disappear as people focus on business as usual and on keeping their jobs. And I guess the final part of that is therefore that recognize that maybe because people are not going to be having these open conversations, they might not put their hands up where they need extra support. I think we've all seen examples in the last few months of different individuals who, because of their personal health, because of their caring responsibilities, because of many other things, may have needed a little bit of extra support. So we all have an obligation as colleagues, but also as leaders to understand where that might be and identify where we can help.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you very much. So I'm just going to have a look at some of the comments in the chat function. I can see somebody saying that they experienced a very high female turnover. I'm going to say this in their gyms, doubled during this period of time. It was shocking. We're trying to get to the bottom of why. I think that probably everything we've heard in terms of the caring responsibilities might have something to do with that. Just a few, while we're waiting for people to type a few more questions or comments. Elliott, I'll start with you. You have shared with us the findings. If you step back, what has really surprised you while you were doing these interviews? I know we've talked about some of the things that people have told you in confidence, and some of your reflections on what they have shared with you. What are the things that you found surprising in a positive and in a negative way?
In a way, slightly easier to do the negative. So I'll start with that. So I think probably two things that have stood out to me. I think number one has been the speed and the ferociousness with which D&I budgets have been cut. I think, yeah, and this isn't science, so don't hold me on these numbers. But if I think sort of pre-COVID-19 as a sector, we were probably investing, say, £10 million a year in D&I initiatives across business, in particular the larger companies. I think that figure is now close to £1 million, i.e. D&I professionals have just been removed from structures, budget slashed, events slashed, network slashed, i.e. all of that investment over the last decade in building up a D&I infrastructure, D&I capability, much of it has now been put to one side in many businesses. And I actually think some of that may be quite difficult to rebuild. So that'd be one thing that has stood out. And the second thing, and I mentioned it in our presentation, was around some of the role models who have been made redundant or are possibly at risk of redundancy. I think quite rightly over the last sort of decade, businesses have invested a lot in these individuals. They've really made them the poster children for diversity. They've been the figureheads. You can be a woman and you can get to EXCO. You can be an ethnic minority and you can get to EXCO. You can be a woman and a pilot. And the fact that a lot of these have exited, I think, really shook me. And I think, of course, a redundancy process needs to be fair and transparent. But I think possibly some of the businesses within our sector could have done more to ring fence or protect some of these individuals. Because I think that, as I mentioned, their exiting will have a disproportionate effect on exclusivity and making the sector attractive. From a positive point of view, I should say, and it's lovely seeing so many people on the webinar today. Just despite everything that's going on in the sector, and in many ways it couldn't be more depressing. So many people are still so passionately engaged in the topic, and they want to do the right thing for their businesses, and they really want to solve the issue. So I think delighted the intent is still there, even if possibly the actions haven't possibly followed through.
Okay, thank you. Katy, what about you, from your perspective? What has surprised you as you were going through the answers from the employee's perspective?
I mean, I think one area that I was pleasantly surprised was kind of across the board, the answer to the question around, did you feel supported by your employer? Not because I don't think businesses in this sector would be supportive, but the reality is, in a sector where we know a lot of people are being made redundant or are kind of experiencing furlough and other reductions in hours and pay, it says something really good about the positive messages and communications that those employers must have been doing, that we still see kind of around 70% of people saying, yeah, I did feel supported. It may well be that my job is not secure and I'm worried about that, but I do feel supported. So it's good to see that overall kind of theme of people care and people and employers are trying to help does seem to have landed.
Yeah, and perhaps some of the budget that was dedicated to diversity and inclusion as a whole has been shifted to well-being and mental health and looking after employees during this period of time, which was absolutely necessary. I'm just thinking, and Elliott, you've touched on that a little bit. As we think about the next stage, we're still seeing on a daily basis the companies announcing their CVAs or going into administration or restructuring, collective redundancies, a second wave or third wave in some cases. However, you have mentioned the there is a question of a competitive advantage if companies do focus on diversity and inclusion and do look at all of this change with an inclusion lens. What are your words to those leaders here that are listening in? Why is it important? Why does it make a difference from your perspective to look at the next stage with that perspective?
I spent a long time today saying about the importance of data. The flip side of that is that commercially, I think a lot of businesses in our sector have become very reliant on data to make decisions about customer, product, and proposition. And in fact, some of the best performing companies in our sector have become very, very data driven in their approach over the last few years. I think a lot of the data we now hold on customers is meaningless. Just a very good example. If you're the Amazon buyer at the moment for consumer electronics, you'd be buying hair clippers because everyone bought hair clippers during lockdown. That is, of course, not a trend that's going to continue. Within the travel, leisure, hospitality sector, we're going to need to go back to basics in many ways and be much, much closer to our customer to really understand what our customer wants. The old tradition of walking the floor, serving the people, hearing the feedback, etc. And if our leadership isn't representative of the customers that our sector is seeking to serve, it will be a major, major issue. So I think the business case for diverse leadership has never been greater. And I'll just add on to that, that I think in the last period, speed of decision making has been absolutely critical, and actually possibly diversity of thought in that decision making process hasn't been useful. But we all know, and there's countless pieces of research here from many more eminent people than us that shows that proper diversity of thought does enable better long-term strategic decisions to be making. So I think from a decision-making point of view, it's very useful. And I think the third thing I would say, and just hopefully a very obvious piece, but I think in today's world, and the BLM movement is just one part of this, I think businesses are going to require what we have at MBS sort of termed a social license to operate from their customers. I.e., customers are less likely to give their businesses that they do not perceive to be doing the right thing on the right issues. And I think diversity is a big part of that. If customers look at the corporate website of X, Y, and Z business and they see an all male, pale, stale group of executive leaders, they're going to think, is this the business that I want to be a part of? Do I want to be a part of this HTL experience? So I think businesses need to do the right thing, and then customers will follow them. So I think for all those three reasons, it will become a commercial, even more of a commercial priority than it has historically. Thank
you. And Katy, this point of data keeps coming back over and over again. I think every single report, every single piece of research that we do, we always emphasize the importance of data. How do we motivate people to, just go after collating, collecting, analyzing, getting their insight from the data? Any thoughts on that can help us step up in that area?
Yeah, I mean, I think all you can say there is, beyond, hopefully we're convincing some people along the way it's a good idea. I think almost going back to what Elliott's saying, I think it also makes a lot of good business sense to have this data. If you are making big decisions on your people without data, I mean, you wouldn't do that. To Elliott's point, most companies wouldn't do that on their customers. They wouldn't launch a new brand. They wouldn't start a new product without looking at customer data. So why would you make a massive decision on your workforce without any people data? And if you think about the future, and you can imagine we spend a lot of time talking about this, and you say, well, what are the skills that I need my workforce to have in the future? What do I need them to be good at? And maybe that's different to where I needed skills or where I needed experience in the past. But if you don't have the data to look at before you make decisions, the reality is you're probably not necessarily going to keep and grow and look after those people with those new and different skills. So even putting aside the diversity part, though of course I think it's really important, and the fairness part, which is absolutely critical, actually, if you're not looking through a few different lenses about how you're making people decisions, you're probably going to make the wrong decisions.
Can we talk about a little bit about the gender pay gap? I know that that's one of your areas of expertise, Katy, and I think this year it was only 50% of companies that have reported a gender pay gap. This is across industry, and only a very small number of companies in our sector have reported that gender pay gap. Now, we've heard from Elliott and from the data that women have been impacted and continue to be impacted by the pandemic. They are leaving the industry, and I think it's a I wouldn't say it's a continuous stream, but the number of emails that I am receiving from women saying, sorry, this is my last day at company so-and-so, I'm leaving the industry, or I'm being made redundant. I mean, the impact on the gender pay gap next year will set us back probably by 5 to 10 years at this rate. Any comments from you on that? Should companies be looking at this now? I think the answer is obviously they should. Should they be reporting? I know that when I remember the government equalities officer told me when they made a decision that it wasn't compulsory to publish the data, and I sent that on to our community, there was immediately, thank God, we don't have to worry about that. There is the other side, which if you don't monitor that and you don't report, you just don't know where you are, and you are going to go backwards. So what are you seeing other industries are doing in that space? So,
well, I'll give you a technical answer and then a general answer. So the technical answer is that suspension on reporting was for last year. So the deadline that is April 21 in respect of April 2020, the government at this point hasn't suspended the deadline. So if you were caught by the regulation, as of today, you must report by the end of April. So that suspension has gone away. When we get that data, it's going to look very strange for this year. And that's because the way the regulation works is for April. And of course, during April, in the hospitality, travel and leisure industry, many employees were on furlough. And if you're on furlough, you're probably not going to be caught in the data analysis. So we're going to get some really strange results next year, which are going to be very hard to interpret. And I suppose that's why I said I'll give a technical answer first, because the technical answer is I have no idea what these numbers are going to look like, but they're going to look really strange. The reality, so what is the gender pay gap trying to measure? It's trying to measure, do we see gender balance across an organization? And the answer is no, we don't. And I think you're right that probably when we look at the statistics we've seen about the number of women on reduced hours redundancy compared to men, we are going to see that gap widen, sadly. And I think companies need to be looking at that data as well as the technical reporting data, because actually that's really what you need to be measuring, particularly next year when all sorts of strange things are going to happen to the data.
Yeah. And also for everybody's benefit, so together with PwC, we're going to look at the impact of all of this from a gender pay gap perspective. So we will be looking at what has been submitted and what we're seeing elsewhere. So that's another piece of research that we will be putting out to the community. I would like to bring Joanna into the conversation now, because Jo has interviewed a number of women from within our industry that have sadly been through redundancies, and there are some key themes that have emerged from these case studies that you will see, these interviews that you will find fully in the report. But just Jo, can you take us through some of your thoughts around what has transpired from these conversations?
Perfect. Thank you, Taya. Yes, I've spoken to a number of women across the industry from all the sectors, many with similar stories and some with very different stories, and I thank them all for sharing them with us. And I'll just share my screen quickly just to share the very kind of key things which you will see have been mirrored in both Katy's research and PwC research and Elliott and the MBS teams. And, you know, I think the analogy I keep hearing about the crisis is that it was the same storm, different ships. You know, people were all experiencing with the same piece, but everyone's experience was very different. And every person really brought up the thing about the pressures during the crisis. So whether it was that you were furloughed and the way that you felt connected or not to business, whether you still worked, and the pressure of childcare, which again has come through in the different research as well. So that really was a very strong theme. And what was very interesting in the case studies was also the kind of cross understanding of people not in the same situation as you. So people who were furloughed really thinking about the pressure of their colleagues in work and vice versa, but all those also those who were made redundant were very worried about their colleagues back in the companies that were still working and retain their jobs. You would think it was the other way around, but around the fact that they felt that, you know, there was a lot of work for fewer people, and that burnout and mental health were really some of the things to be concerned about, which isn't necessarily gender specific, but it came through in all of the conversations. There was definitely a sense of impact on trust, around trust in the industry, trust in the companies, potentially in how furlough had been handled, and also trust, and I think this ties into another point around the backward step, the loss of progression that came through very much, I think, in Elliott and the MBS research, that they could see the change, the step change in progression, whether that was around openness to flexible working, or the exodus really of women from the industry in the sectors that we've said around marketing, digital comms, areas that are more female represented, I suppose. So, and the balance between the transferable skills, this talent drain for people who can take their skills to other industries. But what resonated as well, very interestingly, was the passion that still exists for this industry. And you'll see that in the case studies, people saying, yes, I've tried, I've looked, I've seen, I've actually spoken to other industries, but I just can't get excited about X or Y. It just doesn't ignite the same passion. So I think collectively we have to really be grateful for that, and that passion is still there, but it you know, that impact on trust will really make a difference. And I think lastly, again, came through most of the case studies, was this lack of future thinking that was felt by the senior teams, this kind of hunkering down to old school operational mindsets that was really stopping creativity, innovation, and thinking, how do we build back better? And most people really felt this was going to really impact recovery of the sector, you know, that it would really hamper and impede how quickly we built back. So that was very top line themes, but they were shared across.
Okay, thank you for that. So I would like to finish on a little bit more of a positive note, because I think we've managed to get all of us quite depressed by focusing on you know, what has not gone well, or what we would have liked to see differently. So I know that one of the questions we asked for ourselves in the report is this a backward step? And I think we've heard that you know, in many cases we have gone backwards, but could this be a catalyst for change? So some final reflections, Elliott, from you, and you, Katy. You know, how can we just try and inspire people? This is not all lost. You know, it's tough, but there is a silver lining, and there is some hope.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, you know, without a doubt, we've taken 3 steps backwards. I think how many steps forward we take is now up to us. But I think, ending on the positive note, that there is definitely now huge potential to take some steps forward and to really change the dial on diversity. And in many ways, this does feel like a bit of a watershed. and I'll just highlight, I guess, four things that spring to mind. I think, firstly, and some of this may sound a bit obvious, I think conventional wisdom about the way we work has changed. And we've all now seen that flexible working in its truest sense is possible. And I think in particular, with regard to HDL, that applies to operational roles that used to be field-based. And I think that those roles very often were the roles where we just did not see any progression of women through the ranks. A very good example of that in operations, where you'd see 70-30 women, men working in a pub. By the time you get to general manager level, it's 50-50. At regional manager level, it's 90-10 men here. So I think that any job that is field-based, I think we've now proved can be done flexibly and can be done in a different way. So I think some of those traditional barriers to operational roles are no longer there. I think secondly, that there are going to be inevitable restructures. Research at 89% of companies were considering some sort of restructure. And our previous research with PwC has shown that there's phenomenal diverse talent at board -2 and board -3 that have been waiting for the opportunity to break through. So this could well be their opportunity. Thirdly, I think HDL as a sector is now possibly less attractive to some of the best candidates from outside the sector. And I say this as a headhunter, I think it's positive that as a sector it will force us to look deeper from within the sector when hiring, which will include our own diverse talent. It won't just about be the quick fix of hiring an external diverse leader at board level. And then fourthly, I think things have changed from an inclusion point of view. Over the last period of time, I think it has been impossible for people not to bring their whole self to work. My team has met my kids on too many occasions over the last period. And I think that we now understand on a much more human level who our colleagues are. And I think we're starting to relate to people in a very, very different way. And I think that that will definitely yield benefits over the years to come from a diversity perspective as well.
Thank you. Katy, a final thought from you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the real positive that I take from this is that we're all sitting here having this conversation, to be honest, that all of these very busy senior leaders at an incredibly stressful time were willing to talk to Elliott. That tells you that things are changing. You know, when there was the last kind of big change in the economy following the crash of the banks, nobody was talking about this topic, and a very large number of, we know from the data only about gender, but a very large number of women lost their jobs. And this wasn't a topic that was being discussed. I'm not sure that a week's gone by when I haven't read multiple articles in the paper about the impact on women, on ethnic minorities, the challenges of being a parent and a carer in this time. I think the conversation has moved on. And partly because, exactly as Elliott has said, we all now see more the reality of the challenges that every one of us faces, and the joys as well that each of us faces in our lives outside of work. But the fact we're having this conversation and we're all investing our time and passion in it tells you that things are changing.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for that. So I would like to thank Elliott and the team at MBS, Katy and the team at PwC, John Perry, who has been supporting us behind the scenes, in terms of making this happen, my team, Gina, Joanna, Laura, for bringing all of this together. And I would like to finish with a quote, actually, that one of our advisory board members this morning shared with me. That's from Penny Hughes, the chairwoman of the GYM Group. She said, "A change is the moment when differences can be made." And I do believe that this crisis can act as a catalyst for more positive gendered and ethnic change if we're able to harness the benefits and mitigate the risks. Thank you, all of you, for joining us this afternoon. I hope you will join us on the 8th of October to hear about the fundings in relation to race and ethnicity. And before I let you all go, don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn. It's nearly our birthday in a couple of times for WiHTL, and I really, really do want to get to 2,000 followers. We're nearly there. So all of you, please follow us on LinkedIn. Look forward to seeing all of you. Thank you very much. Have a lovely afternoon. Goodbye.